Hey everyone, welcome to the 7th episode of the Liam McCullum Show. Today I have a very special guest on. It's my cousin. You want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Don. Don Corcoran.
Well, Don, do you wanna maybe introduce yourself with your background and a little bit about your journey and what you're going through right now?
Oh, all that stuff.
Yes.
Well, I think a proper introduction would, I'm a married man, very happily married. My wife, Cassidy, is a dream, and we have 3 kids. We have my oldest, Gideon, is 9, Tristan is 8, and Josiah is 5. They all have warrior names, and that's my family, and that's the most important thing to me. So I guess one of the things we'll probably get into is family and life, and I am currently on a cancer journey, and so that is where we are now, 18 months into MDS, myelodysplastic syndrome, which is a blood cancer, which I may have pronounced a little off. My wife is better at the pronunciations of all of the terms, but I do have it. I'm a mutant. I have a mutant gene, and so we're just finished our 19th round of chemo. So when I do chemotherapy, I do 7 days on, 3 weeks off. So the last 18 months have been full. I've had 4 bone marrow biopsies, and had a port put in, had a blood transfusion, and all sorts of other little things. So a couple hundred doctor appointments, and a very full 18 months. And so that's the journey we're on now. Is walking through. I'm on life extension, so my chemotherapy is to keep me alive. So when people ask, I guess I tell them it's like a car that's got bald tires on it, and it's almost winter, but you want to run those tires until you want to wait till as long as you can before you put those winter tires on. But so we're kind of in that mode of survival, of just going week to week, checking my numbers. And so my chemotherapy is not life saving, it's life preserving. So I guess, basically it's to keep me alive until transplant, and transplant would be the possible cure. And that has its own inherent dangers, and that's why they're kind of pushing it back as far as possible. So that's a little introduction to where we are and kind of what's happening.
And do you wanna say a little bit about your last time visiting Seattle and your numbers and everything like that?
Yeah, I can give a little bit of that. Again, my wife is, every time I start to tell people, she corrects. So I kind of get a general, like I have an understanding of what's happening in my body, but the general overview is my platelets are really low. So I have issues with red blood cells and white blood cells that we're always monitoring, and neutrophils, and there's all these different numbers. For whatever reason, I just kind of zone in on the platelets, and those ones make the most sense to me, because the average person has, I think it's 150,000 to 450,000 platelets. Mm-hmm. And I believe 75,000, anything under that's critical. It's either 75,000 or 50,000. But I believe it's 75,000. Under that is critical. And my current numbers are, the last time we were tested was 13,000 before my last round of chemo. And then those numbers raised up to 15,000. And if they drop under 10,000, we'll look for a transplant, because there's a lot of complications that happens if it drops under 10,000. Then they want to do blood transfusions. And since I'm getting a stem cell replacement, and that's, we're dealing with blood cancer, they don't want different transfusions of different bloods and then try to have a transplant because it's problematic. Mm-hmm. So if I drop low into the 10,000s, they'll just want to go ahead and cut me or whatever. I don't think they even cut me. I think it's a different, I like the dramatic aspect of saying cut me, but it is a dangerous, procedure. People die in it. So of course there's chemotherapy that's intensive, and radiation right before, and they basically, rid your body of all of the things and they replace them. So all of the things is a very technical scientific term.
Right. And you were saying that the chemo has actually, you've been doing pretty well on it. You haven't had a lot of side effects or anything like that.
Yeah, I've been really, really, really lucky. I think God has been good to me for sure. We take we bring a lot, to our treatments as far as what we do as a family, and so I have a lot of things that I do that I think are very helpful. How we eat, what we put in our body, what we put on our body, all those controlled things, sleep, keep stress, anxiety, worry, like out, not, we stay far away from those things. They come up sometimes, but I think mental health, the way you think about, where you're at, is very important. But, we do a lot of things to keep healthy. And I think after 19 rounds, we've been, 130 some, infusions, and I feel fantastic. Mm-hmm. So my numbers,
too.
Well, thank you. That's what my wife says. She doesn't say that. I wish she did. Just kidding. But anyways, no, it's I think there's a lot that goes into the health aspect of it. Some things are in your control, some are not. So the things we can control, we do. And so, and then we just live, in as much joy as possible. We talk about the tightrope, because you're really on a tightrope without a net. So, I've had 3 friends in the last 18 months that on the cancer journey that died. And so it can happen pretty sudden where, someone's doing, well in their treatment, and then they get sick, and, then sometimes it's, pneumonia or different things that will take them. And sometimes it happens pretty rapidly. So you're well aware that even as you're doing treatments and things are going well, that you're constantly reminded about people that that are, passing. And so that's a very real aspect of the cancer journey is you're walking the tightrope of death,
Yeah.
But we have joy in it. And so we say it, we dance the tightrope.
And to get more into that conversation, can you just say a little bit about what you've been doing with your podcast and storytelling and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was diagnosed, I was working in consulting, leadership consulting, and we were, as a family, my wife and I, our company Point of Contact, our focus, was a lot of presentations and a lot of things, for companies. And we'd work in tandem with, her on the tech side and, doing video and editing and presentations. And so we were doing those things, but and that was the source of income. And on my own private time with my kids, for years, I've been telling them stories. So my grandpa, I remember as a young kid, him telling stories, and he would make up these stories about animals and races and all sorts of, always seemed to have a carrot always had, he was always scaring someone out of their shoes and taking their shoes. And I just remember that as a kid, it was always his thing. And so I remember with my kids, I'd read them books, but I thought, well, why don't I just, create some stories? And so I started when they were, they must have been like 4. Gideon might have been 4, I think, when I first started telling him stories. He's 9 now. And there were some rabbits living in our backyard. And the kids would always go to the back and they would press their nose against the window and they would watch the rabbits run around. So when it came time to create a story, I just made up a story about the hoppities, and they were the rabbits in the backyard. So it would always start out like this. It was many, many years ago in a land far away, deep in the heart of the Billings Heights. At the end of a long road was a cul-de-sac, and in that cul-de-sac was a yellow-brown house. Behind that house where the wood fences met was a brown trim shed with big doors. Beneath those doors was a hole. It was a rabbit hole that led to a rabbit palace, and in that palace lived 5 bunnies, the bunnies 5. Daddy Bunny, Mommy Bunny, and 3 baby bunnies. Together they were called the Hoppities. They lived together and loved together and played together and shared together. On this day, and then I'd run into a story. Now the stories would go usually about something that happened in the day. So, I was Big Hopper, my wife's Mama Hopper. She's Slender Bunny in the origin stories when I meet her. And but she has this really ridiculous voice. It's, oh my goodness, and she's just, everything's frantic. And my wife is just like harmony and peace and just always in control. So it's funny. I created it's like a Julia Child, like on steroids. But anyway, so, and of course I tried to do my voice like, Clint Eastwood, really cool, Yeah. But the kids are Hop Hop, Soft Hop, and Little Hop. And in the stories, like one day Gideon was at a park and some kid came down the slide and then punched him in the face for no reason, and so he's dealing with his first. So I started to create at night, if things happened that were challenging in the day, I would create a story around it. So then the riffraffers were the neighbors that were the bullies, and they smoke and, they steal and they do all that stuff. So they became, and so I would create all these different characters, and eventually there's like 30 characters with backstories and voices. And then they would, I'd have to create new kind of territory for them, and eventually it became a universe, like Bunny World, and then Dragon World, and then sometimes the worlds would collide. So anyways, but the idea behind the stories was, to share that time with them, and then I would use them as characters. So it didn't take them long to go, which one am I, Dad? Am I Little Hop or Soft Hop? And I'm like, they know they're the bunnies. Right. Like, I never told them. And so it was a good way to work out things and to give principles and life lessons. And so that happened. And I have a friend, Zena, who's a screenwriter and an actress and director, and just really talented. And I told her I would tell stories, and she works with, she's a professor and teaches, and she just said, don't talk to me, just write them. And I'm like, no. She's like, just write them down. Like, she didn't want to hear anything. And I was just kind of sharing that I tell stories. So I thought, okay, maybe I should preserve them. So I would tell them a story, and then I'd write it. When I was done, I'd write it down, but it would always be right before bed, late at night. And I would just make them up as I go. And sometimes it'd be 20, 25 minute long story. So when I would go back to write it, it was kind of cliff notes, and I hated the process. It was just laborious, and it was no fun. So then I was like, wait a minute, I'll just record them. So I started taking my phone and then recording the stories. And that was, a couple years in. And so now I think we have like 140 stories. Some of them the longest is like a 40-minute one, and most of them land between 20, 25 minutes. Mm-hmm. And so there's, hours and hours and hours and hours. And what's cool is we put them on their iPods. So they can listen to the stories whenever they want. So before bed, I'll tell them a story, but if I'm not home, then they can listen to bunny stories. Mm-hmm. So like my proudest moments are when I come in and they all have, a bunny story on, and they're listening to it as they fall asleep. And the reason why is, for one, I want to speak into their life, and I want to be able, I've always thought I want the last thing they hear before they go to bed is to be my voice. Mm-hmm. And now that changed, well, didn't change, but the impact of that obviously changed when I was diagnosed, and, when you're sitting in the doctor's office and they say, live in the present. Mm-hmm. And you're like, what? Mm-hmm. And then you realize that, you have, your time could be short. And so now, because I preserved those, right after a diagnosis, there was a thing called Story Night that popped up on Facebook, and it was at the Montana Gallery. It's an art gallery, and I saw it. And since I'd been telling stories to my kids all these years, it just interested me. So I thought I would go, and so I did. And I didn't know what the format was, and so I just went to sit and listen. But as it was going, I realized there have been things going on in my head as I was processing being diagnosed, and that my time could be very short. And at that time, I thought it was possible it was weeks, because we hadn't got, the full diagnosis. And so I thought this could be weeks or months. When it comes back, they could tell me you just have weeks to live. And so when I went, I had some thoughts in my head and I thought the format worked where people could just stand up and give a story. And so, but this is different than kid stories because it's for adults. And so I got up and gave a story that really turned out to be kind of chronicling what I was going through. And I kind of stumbled across an art format that fit my skill set and my kind of life trajectory, that each month I would come back and I was able to share another story. And it really became like journaling for me, where through story I could share. And so I would go back every month and share a story. And then that kind of developed, me into a storyteller and a public speaker in that venue. And so through that, there was a story. The second story I ever told was, the first one was I Love My Yard. And then the second one was The Time Machine. And that was one that was inspired by my son. And I won't give it away because as a storyteller, people can go find it and listen.
And we'll link to it. I'll link to it below.
Okay. Yeah. And so The Time Machine, in it, my son inspired that. And, can I give that away? I'll give it away. You go listen to it anyways. But there was a moment where he asked me if I would, he asked me, he had a heart fright, he said, and he wanted me to get into bed and snuggle with him. And I think he was 7 at the time. So I jumped up in his bunk and he just asked me, he said, it was quiet, I could hear his heart beating and you could tell he was, something was going on. And he was like, Dad, do dads leave? And, that's a hard question to have when you have a diagnosis that, So I said, yes, son, sometimes they do. My dad left when I was 21 and some, and so that does happen. And he said, Dad, I'm going to build you a time machine. That way, if anything ever happens to you, then I can come back and visit you anytime I want. And from that came the story of the time machine. And not, probably, 6 months after that, kind of developed into the idea of realizing when I would talk to other cancer patients, one in particular, Jill, who's now passed, we talked and she, realizing there was things she would like to say to maybe her husband or to her kids, that realized I get to say those things in my stories all the time. And some people, maybe there's things they would like to journal, but she wasn't somebody to journal. And sometimes there's things that maybe you want to say, but you don't know how to say it, or maybe the other person's not able to receive it at the moment because you're walking such dangerous ground that emotionally sometimes, So I thought about the fact that I remember as we spoke, she said, well, I'm not a storyteller like you. Because we talked about journaling and it was too laborious for me, but I did it orally and through story. And so I realized the stories she had been telling me just about her life were powerful, but she was seeing herself as, I can't stand in front of 100 people, and tell a story, which is not uncommon because, public speaking is one of the biggest fears next to like dying by being set on fire or something is public speaking. So I realized then that if people could hear the conversation we were having, the value it would have. And that if you have kids like I do that are young, I tell them bunny stories, but my boy's 5. And I always had this thought when he was 3, when I was diagnosed, that he might not remember me. But if we record the stories I do, and so they are for an audience and it's for them. But it's also within mind that my kids will be able to hear me speak as an adult to adults. So when they become an adult, that will be preserved. And so I realized that some people don't have that, but we could sit and just have a conversation and those things could be preserved, and like a time machine, people could come back and visit that and hear their voice and hear their thoughts on their journey. And so out of that came the Time Machine podcast. And it's, I sit down with people on the journey. It's experiencing the cancer journey through the eyes of the traveler. And so we get to hear, and it gives them a platform to share, their life, their diagnosis, their treatment, and wherever they want to go, whatever that's important to them to talk about. That's what we talk about. So that's what the Time Machine podcast is.
So I want to get into some of the concepts that you brought up in your last story. I found it very interesting. I want to preserve the story as well, but you had different stories that all had to do with ships, and I find it interesting because you were telling me how these different stories, like how, and this doesn't spoil the story altogether, but you bought that ship to build with your son, but then you had a dream about a ship as well, and then you found out that the name of the ship that you were going to build with your son was Jack Kennedy's, right? Mm-hmm. And then at that moment when they all came together, you realized this could work as one big story. So what do you take from that? Do stories just come to you like that often, or?
They do. I would like to say that, I create them and they're, but the truth is they come to me and they're given. And there's the process. I've learned that, thoughts and ideas will come and then I'll form them, but they do truly feel like they come and they're given, and then I work them out. Mm-hmm. And so when they come, they just, I feel like they're divinely given, and I navigate them, and then I protect them, and then I work them to make sure that they're formed right. But I feel like they're given, and I'm a steward of the story. Now the stories, usually involved or my life, but they're really not about me. I mean, and often I'll bring in, stories that deal with other people, but the idea and the concept behind it really is to just be a mirror that people can experience, this walk through death, the valley of shadow of death that we're walking through, and they can kind of, experience it themselves. So the stories like that one, that was called Deep Water. And that was the longest story that, most of my stories had been in the 12 to 15, 17 minute range. And that was almost like 3 stories kind of united in one. And that was right before I was leaving to go get, my transplant that was dangerous. And, they actually called it off because basically I could die in the transplant. So they decided to wait. So that was that's a important story for me. The license plates on my wife's vehicle are Deep Waters. And that's the name of the story. And it's really, it talks about ships, but it's really navigating through death and through life. And so it deals with those type of concepts. And, but yeah, that one came to me and just felt like I was a steward of it. Right. Like I look back and these things were around me and it happened, like the dream and the boat. And then I just look and they just all united, and it just was, it was there. It was complete.
And now to talk about those concepts, like walking through the valley of death and stuff like that, we were talking earlier about with the news, with the coronavirus and stuff like that, how not a lot of people are consciously aware of the fact that they're, finite beings, that we're all going to die. And now that the coronavirus is a thing, people are like afraid and they're projecting that anger on people, and like they want to blame people. And you were talking about that before, but can you explain what it was like when you first were confronted with your diagnosis? Did it, and especially within the framework of your faith, and how everything came together and your reaction to that?
Yes, I could. So when I was 47, when I was diagnosed, so 18 months ago, and I've kept care of myself and eat healthy and exercise and felt fantastic. So when I sat down for got a blood test because I was bruising and thought it was it was going to be just a simple little thing. It was surprising to hear live in the present and to know that some of the things that some of the symptoms and the things that we were dealing with, there was someone else I knew that had similar things that was given, diagnosis of a couple months to live. And it's funny how you latch on to those things. Now, I don't remember all of it, but I remember if this is that, I might only have 2 months.
Right.
And so when I went in to see, so when they sent the blood work to, on, and then we went to see the oncologist, I walked in with, in my head, prepared that you have 2 months. And so when they said, more life extension, a couple years is what we're, hopeful, and then maybe a transplant could be the cure, I was like, yes, But we were going to Fort Smith with the family, and so we'd gotten a buddy has a place up there, and we were gonna go up there with my wife and kids, and then my brother-in-laws, my brothers, and some we're all gonna meet up there and go get on the river. And so we were heading out of town, and we got that diagnosis, and then we picked up the kids, and then drove up there. And I remember I went to the bathroom, and then I came back, and they had talked cancer, and I missed that. And so then when I got to live in the present, I knew something was up. And so I went outside as we were leaving, and my wife said, I don't want to do this alone. And so we drove, and we got up there and kind of got the kids settled. And then I went for a walk with her, and we grabbed her hand, and we went for a walk. And I said, babe, what do you think? And she said, well, I'm not mad. I'm not angry. I don't think, God screwed us, or, I'm not angry at God. She goes, I might cry, but I'm not afraid. And she said, I just wish that young Don wouldn't have prayed that prayer. And so I kind of paused for a little bit, and because I wasn't quite sure what she was talking about. I said, what prayer is that? And she said, when you would pray, Lord, put me in dangerous places, put me in places others don't want to go. So I was like, I remember that. And I'd come out of 15 years of addiction, heavy, heavy, heavy addiction. And when I came out of that, I grew up in the church, and I knew truth, but had traumas in my life and things that, when I was introduced to alcohol and drugs, I used that to self-medicate. And I want to be very clear, I'm not a victim. I mean, things happened to me, but I made those choices, knew that they were not good and, for me. And after 15 years of heavy addictions, I came out of, and that was, heavy duty alcoholic, and then any drug, anytime, if you put multiple drugs on the table, yes, let's put that and that and that and that together and see what happens. So, I was, a high level drug addict and alcoholic, and came out of that. And so when I did, I remember going, I remember I was in jail in Los Angeles. I got arrested I got a DUI, and I was working in a bar in Venice, and drove erratically on the freeway on the way home, and got the ride to the Pokey, the Crowbar Motel. And I remember getting on my knees, and there was like 100 guys in this, holding cell, and I just was done, because it's like, I'd been arrested 13, 14 times, always drinking, fighting, so I wasn't like, I didn't think I was like a criminal. I was just, I just like to drink, and, often fights would ensue because I drank 5-6 times a week. I put myself in those environments all the time. So, so that was, kind of, part of the deal. But I remember just getting on my knees. I'd known the truth my whole life and I had ran away. And so I did. I prayed, Lord, put me, I was mad that I made the decision. I was kind of angry that I had bought into all these lies that allowed me to, justify doing the things I was doing that I knew was wrong. And so I just remember being, I'm a fighter. And so I was mad about that, going like, and so my thing was, Lord, put me in places, that others won't go. But when my wife said that, I remember saying to her, because I prayed that, and I remember I said, well, why would you say that? And she said, because it's always been that way for us. So the 10 years plus we've been married, I think 10 years at the time, we had went through seemed like one big life crisis after another. And they were things that, I'd entered into, and she followed me into, because I felt clearly this is what God is calling me to do. And it was one thing after another, like losing everything, losing, $250,000 in a business and having a baby and coming home to a 400 square foot renovated garage right after losing everything, living in Los Angeles and having a new baby and going, all right, what a way to start a marriage, right? Because, we were dating through the time that I invested in the gym. So it was one kind of crisis after another that, it seemed to be, and so she said, it's always been that way for us. And I remember again, I paused and said, well, what would the alternative be? And she goes, not good. We'd be safe and we wouldn't be in the fight. We wouldn't, we wouldn't be able to be used. We would be safe. And so I told her, I said, that prayer was not mine. Like, I prayed that, but I felt like it was, God gave that to me to pray. Because I don't know why I was praying it. I just would. I would like, Lord, put me in dangerous places, put me where others, don't want to go. And now looking back and getting diagnosis, we are in a very dangerous place, but there's a peace that we have in the deep water because we know that God is sovereign and we know He's in control and that I've submitted my life to Him and He can take me if He wants, or, or He can, if He chooses to keep me here longer, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Like, it's His will, not mine. And like Pastor Ken, my mentor, said on the last podcast I did with him, he said when he didn't know what to pray, when he had his cancer diagnosis, he said to God, you choose for me. And that he had told me this and right before my diagnosis. And so when I went up to, after that walk with my wife, I went and talked to every one of my family members. We went for a walk, every one of them, because I realized I want to tell them everything. I want to have conversations about where I'm at and what's possible and what I think of them. I wanted them to know I loved them, and some of the uncles I wanted to ask them things for my boys. Will you do this? Will you teach them to fish? Will you do So there was some emotion in that, but there was also this great joy. So when we were at the cabin, I would be watching my kids play. There's times I had to get up and leave and go outside to cry. And I didn't want my wife to see me because I didn't want her to misinterpret it. I wasn't fearful. I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because I had such a deep joy that it was overwhelming. Like, as I would watch my kids, it was like this depth of joy that it was just so much gratitude. And I was just like, I love the life that God has given me. I love my wife and my kids. I'm so absolutely fulfilled. Like, if I do die now, man, I am blessed beyond what I deserve. And, in those moments though, it solidifies like what's important. All little things kind of go away. And the one thing for me as a servant of Jesus Christ and as a follower that has submitted my life to Him after years and years of, rebellion and doing, I was a wretched human. I was arrested 13, 14 times, but I should have been 10 times that. Like, for every time I got arrested, it probably should have been another 10. But, I just am very well aware of who I am under my own devices. Is a very destructive, self-destructive, and damaged people around me, and very selfish, and about every human failing that someone could have, I maximized. And so to have a life, to be 10 years free of at that time of alcohol or drugs, and now more, and to have this beautiful, talented, incredible wife that's a fantastic mother and just an incredible human being, and I have these beautiful kids that I was just like, I don't deserve any of these things, you know. So I had this depth of just gratitude, and you know, I had about a 48-hour window of kind of that I remember of sorting some things out. And really what it came down to was there came a point where I'm like, okay, my wife, she knows God. What's most important for me is that my children know the truth, and I was like, I want to be there to model and show them what a man of God, you know, truly, you know, walks out in life, and I aspire to do that, and all my failings, and only through the power of Jesus Christ could I even do anything good. If, you know, anything good is of him and the rest is me. But I had those thoughts of going, I'd like to be here to show them and to teach them things that, you know, and I had a moment where I just felt, you know, God speak to me, and it wasn't an audible voice. I feel God speaks through his word and through his spirit. And I just, it was very clear though, I don't need you. And some would think that's harsh, and it was the most comforting thing. I realized, you know, the God who created all things, that, you know, spoke all things into being, that, you know, he does not need me. And the scripture is very clear. It's the Holy Spirit that draws. And so God may use you to be a part of that, but he doesn't need you. And so, you know, I realized I didn't have to have any fear or worry, that God loves my children, and he will do with them what he wants and take care of them. And I just hope that if he gives me the opportunity to be there on that ride, then, you know, then I'm very thankful. And if not, I don't have to fear it. Mm-hmm. And once that fear lifted of just worry of my kids, like, well, what, you know, what will life be without a dad? What will it be like when they come to my funeral? I mean, you see your kids, and, you know, you see them, you can, at least I do, I don't know about other people, I can imagine them at the funeral. And, you know, I've been at funerals where, you know, kids are there, and they'll come up and say, you know, did you hear about my mom? And, you know, at 8 years old, and that's the same age, and going, that child that I mourn for losing their parent now will be mine. Mm-hmm. So those moments, that alleviated that. And so I don't fear death. You know, there's Psalms 23 says, you know, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still water. He guides me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I learned that when I was a child, and I would talk to Pastor Ken about it. And he said to me, he was a minister for 40 years, 60, he's 89. And so even then when he wasn't in active ministry, he was still constantly counseling and working with people. And he told me this, he said, you know, I used to look at that verse and I would pray to God and say, what does that mean? In the valley of the shadow of death. And he said, he goes, here's what I feel like God showed me. Because I didn't hear a voice, it wasn't an audible voice, but I feel like he showed me this, that the valley of the shadow of death is life itself. It's not just a moment where people, when they hear that verse, sometimes I think if they're on their deathbed or if they're surviving like a car crash and they're in the hospital and they're in the ER, like that's, the valley of the shadow of death is life. You know, the wages of sin is death, the Bible says. It's for once to die and then the judgment. And so we live under the curse of sin and death. So from the time we come into this world, you know, death is always hovering near us. And so we're always walking through that. And it is appointed for everyone to die. So when it talks about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, but I shall fear no evil, I think that's it's such a powerful thing to when you can understand that these things are possible and will happen, but you can live free of anxiety, worry, or fear. Mm-hmm. And that's something that sometimes you can only find through the testing. Mm-hmm. And you know, I was in Seattle for the appointment with my transplant doctor, and just a couple weeks ago. And when I was there, I sometimes get ideas for stories. And so I'll just write them down. And I thought, this thought just kept coming to me about what I wanted to be around was the Death Walkers. And it kept coming to me. And there's that movie, was a Sean Penn movie, Dead Man Walking. Mm. And sometimes I've thought of that, like, as we come in, but I was like, no, that doesn't fit. I'm not a dead man walking. That's like a guy that's walking to death and he's going to be executed. It's like, no. But there was something close there. And I was like, no, that's not it. It's not Dead Man Walking. And so when I was in Seattle, I started writing some stuff down. I was like, the Death Walkers. And to me, what a Death Walker is, those are the people I want to surround myself with. They say this. They say that you are a reflection of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I think that's true. They also say that, adversity will introduce a man to himself. And I believe that's true. What I found out is death, or the prospect of death, or death to a family member, death will introduce a man to his faith. And so I look to surround myself with death walkers. And what a death walker to me is somebody that will walk through the valley of the shadow of death without fear. I have a friend, Jacob Persley. He's a missionary in Turkey. Turkey has 80 million people, and there's 4,000 or 5,000 Christians roughly. And there was a mass genocide of Christians at the turn of the century, and or I think it was maybe I'm not sure if that date's right, but like 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very small population. He moved there, and he moved there from Arkansas because he said he grew up in the Bible Belt, grew up in church, and then realized one day when he heard the gospel that he thought he was a Christian, but realized he wasn't. And he understood the fullness of the gospel, gave his life to God, shared that with a friend of his that was from Turkey, and he came into relation with God, and then told him, all of my ancestors, everybody, all of them are in hell. None of them were ever given the gospel. And he said when he heard that, he felt like a burden, and so he moved his wife and his family. They moved to Turkey. It took them a couple years to learn language, and then became missionaries there. And he tells the story of there's heavy persecution for Christians, and there was 2 pastors that were killed, and they were drugged through the streets. And he tells a story about how the wives, when they were interviewed, said, we forgive those that did this. And it caused like such commotion, because in the culture there, revenge is the way that you avenge this. And so he was telling the story about this, and then kind of the culture and the climate of where he lived, and how he felt this was a great opportunity for him to be able to be in this area where nobody hears the gospel. So he's walking down the street, and he said there was a mosque, and this lady would yell out to him in Kurdish, or there's a couple languages he speaks, I forget the other, and but she would yell out to him, do you believe in Muhammad? Do you believe in the prophet? And he would say, no, I believe in Jesus. And she would yell out. The first time she asked him questions, and then the next time he came through with a friend, and the friend is a minister from America. And so I heard him tell the story, and Jacob, when he told the story of walking with him, hearing this lady scream out to him going over, her yelling to the crowd, and people crowding around him because he doesn't believe in the prophet. And he was fearful because he has a child at home, and he realizes this could go really bad, where American Christians in this Muslim world, and this may people here do get killed. And he was introducing Jacob and to speak, and was telling this story. And then when Jacob spoke, he said, so we're walking down the street, and this lady yells out, and so I tell her, and then she starts to yell at the men, he doesn't believe in Allah, he doesn't believe in the prophet. And he says, what a divine moment that God ordained this to happen, that I would be here and they would ask questions. And now these people get hear the gospel for the first time. And I was like, that's what a death walker is. Totally unafraid. Knows that, of course, his life, could end at any time. His friends that have died. But he is so sure and knows the truth and is willing to share it and willing to die for his faith. And to me, that's the kind of people I want to be around, people that are willing to die for the things they believe in, die for their family, die for their faith. Most importantly, to me, I believe as a Christian that the walk of a believer is not what you see on TV. So for the people out there listening that are not, that have never really heard the gospel or have never see Christians as the guys on TV that are asking for your money, as a Christian, I will tell you, they are not part of us. they are frauds. And so for those that, you'll see those that will get on TV and ask you for your money, but they would never step into an environment where their life is in danger because they truly don't believe what they're saying, They're in it for totally different reasons. They're what I would call an infiltrator. But when we go to the infusion center and we walk through, we do things, we film every time we go in and we recreate things, we call them walkout videos because we're walking into, a fight for our life. And we do those to have fun and to show, because I want my kids to show that we're unafraid. And I want them not to be afraid of death. I want to see that there's joy in life, even when you're facing, death. So to me, I want to be surrounded by death walkers, people that are unafraid and will step into dangerous places and will put their life on the line for the things they believe and for other people. So,
well, just one last comment or a concept that I kind of want to talk about, or at least a theme that I saw throughout everything that you just said there is this idea that I think a lot of non-believers wouldn't really understand, that when confronted with suffering, you don't shake your fist at God. The idea that in suffering you can find joy. I think that a lot of people, even non-believers, do ask in those moments of grief, and in those moments of suffering, they ask, why God, even if they don't believe. The name God comes to mind. They say, if there is a God, why would they do this? Yeah. But to me, that has always been God presenting himself to them. Just the simple question, why would you do this to me? If there is a God, why would I think that is, him presenting himself? So can you just expand on what about suffering made you the person you are, and how it has shaped your faith, and what people should do when they are confronted with suffering?
Yeah, well, try to. For me, I don't see, as of now, I don't feel like what we're doing, other people see it as suffering. I've been, and other people that go through cancer are suffering at different levels. It's different for everyone. Yes, we have the weight of preparing for life after me if God, doesn't spare my life, if my time is short. So, you go through those things. But, I think what it comes down to is a true believer is understanding that we're made in the image of God. And, we're fallen and we're sinful, and if we were to get what we truly deserve, that's really horrific. And that's separation from God, and that's punishment for the things that we've done. And, that's the whole story of the cross, is that he bore our sin for us. There's that moment, I had someone say this to me. We had a conversation about had the walk, and I talked about, where I was, and the person said, whose ministry background said, well, Don, it's okay to have fear and being, have anxiety or whatever. Well, I'm good. And people didn't seem to want to believe that. They wanted to project their fear onto me. And they would say, no, it's okay. And it's okay if you're fearful or, you're suffering and these things. And then the conversation went to, well, even Jesus, was fearful and suffering. And when he was sweating blood in the garden, and it was like, no, I think you're misunderstanding the passage. Jesus was not fearful to go to the cross. He was not sweating blood because he was fearful of man. There's martyrs throughout history that have walked, to their death by fire, singing while engulfed in flames. Mortals, just humans like you and me in that moment, fearless. And then you're telling me you think Jesus was terrified of man and the cross? He is fully God, fully man. When he said, "Let this cup pass from me," what Jesus was saying is what is in the cup is the cup that he was saying, "If it be your will, let this cup pass from me." It was the wrath of God that was in the cup. Jesus was sweating blood because he was about to take the full wrath of God that was meant for sinful humanity completely on himself. Jesus was not fearful of man or death. He was taking that punishment on himself. And the Bible says it pleased God to crush him. And this is where a lot of people maybe haven't really read through Scripture and understand the relation between God and sin. He said he pleased God to crush his own son. That is the weight of sin. That is how a holy, righteous, just God has to hate sin. People will say, God is love. He is, but he also hates. He must hate sin. He has to. He must hate murder if he is love. And so that's part of it. So when the suffering, to live is Christ, to die is gain. So the time here we have is a gift, and it is short. And we are to count it joy, all these sufferings, and the things that we may endure because of the gospel, because of the walk of obedience to Christ. So it's not a macho thing at all. It's like, I'm very weak. The Bible says his power is made perfect in our weakness. So the strength that we have through this comes from him, not of our own. And it's not macho. It's not like, I have this assurance and this absolute deeply embedded peace because I know who God is. I know who I'm in relation to him. And that I've read, that I have, what Jesus did on the cross has put me in right relation with God, and that I'm obedient and willing to live for him and willing to die for him. And knowing that in those moments of fear in the deep water, when Jesus calmed the storm, it's when I'm feeling the deep water and the fear, I realize that it's God who's sovereign and is in control, and I submit my life to him, and there's a peace that comes that passes all understanding, and there's no way to describe to someone unless they're walking in that peace. Mm-hmm. So I don't see suffering as I think it's an honor if God calls you to a position where you may suffer to glorify his name, but it's nothing to do with ourselves. There's one misconception that drives me crazy when people will talk about people they're like, this great man of God, this guy, he's such a great man of God. And like, there is no great man of God. There are none. There are weak, broken sinners that are, that left to their own devices do things like me, that that if they submit themselves and are obedient to the calling of God in their life, he can use to do great things through you. But in spite of you, it's nothing to do with you. It's only his power through you. His power is made perfect in your weakness. And that's why I feel like we have a really good relationship, because I bring a lot of weakness, like immense amounts of failure and weakness. And he brings, his power through that if I submit to him. So anything, so the suffering, to glorify the suffering Christian, I think is the wrong, if someone does that is wrong. It's, if you are a believer and God, there are trials and things you go through, it's, and you can get this joy and peace because you know who God is and he is guiding you and giving you that peace. It should always direct back to the cross. It should always direct back to Jesus and what he did, and the power of the Holy Spirit that moves through us is all is him. So I hope that kind of answers it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And is that when you were asking for challenges in life, do you think that part of that was because you knew that you deserved what was coming, and then you also wanted to be molded by the struggle? Or
well, for one, I think when I said, you mean the prayer?
Yeah.
For one, I believe God gave that to me. But yes, part of me was, I was mad. I was angry that I knew the truth. I had grown up in the church and I had been given truth and foundational truth, and I knew it. And when I was doing the things I was doing, the excess and the drugs and the violence and all the things for 15 years, I made those choices, and I slowly, as I did them more and more, I distanced myself, from, but I could be sitting with someone. I remember being, in a 3-day binging party and a pile of cocaine on the table, and someone bring up God. Mm-hmm. And I would go, oh, like I know the truth. Like I always knew the truth. Like I was running away, but I looked around, I remember thinking to myself, these people may not know the foundational truth of the gospel that I do know, and I can't tell them because I'm high as a kite. And I'm like, but there was something in me that I knew the truth. Mm-hmm. And so even in those darkest moments, I felt like I knew the truth. So when I came out of that and I thought of all the damage and all of the, I was blasphemous. I purposely dressed up as Jesus on Halloween to blaspheme. I was like, I knew what I was doing. I was like, so, I looked back at those things that made me mad. And, growing up, and having, just growing up in a culture of violence that, I ended up, having to fight. You had to fight, otherwise you would just get beat up all the time. So, I had to learn to fight. And so I think part of the way that God made me as a fighter and as, someone that in his providence, there was no he was not unaware of the path. Mm-hmm. And he allowed me to go and to make those choices, but I think he was forming me in those, that when I came out, I was like, I want to fight. Like I'm mad. And the fight is different though. The fight for a believer is not go, punch someone in the mouth. It's like, it's going, are you willing, the way you fight is that you're willing to die to yourself. Mm-hmm. When, the true Christian walk is not this prosperity, like you do this and God gives you this and I declare this and I get whatever, I just declare this and prosperity, Joel Osteen, everything's happy, all that, that's just not the truth of the gospel. And those guys they're liars. That's why they're, that's why they, have the private jets and, that's not the truth. When you actually come, what you're promised is, when you give your life to Christ, he says, pick up your cross and follow me. You're promised salvation and a cross to die on. That's the Christian walk, that you die to yourself. Your life is not your own. You're on assignment from that point on to do what God directs you to do. And it's often things you don't want to do. And it's things that you are not able to do without his power. And they're sometimes scary. That's the walk of a believer, is to submit your life totally. Your life's not your own, and that you die to yourself. You are a servant of Jesus Christ. You're a slave Like, I'm a slave to Christ Jesus. Like, my life is not my own. I willingly am a slave to Christ. You know, I don't dictate, you know, you know, Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but by me. That is the truth. And I'm just, my goal is to be able to hear the voice of God, not audibly, but, you know, Jesus said, I'm the good shepherd, my sheep will know my voice. Like, I wanted to, when I was in those dark times, it got to a point where I felt like I was so far from God, like I couldn't hear. But there was still those faithful moments where he would, you know, call out to me, and I knew, you know, and why he allowed me to live a lifestyle that was so blatantly opposed, and I was thumbing my nose at God, and I was, you know, blaspheming all the time, and then, you know, he still loved, and I don't know why he chose to you know, to bring me out of that and to give me all the gifts I have now. So I believe my life now is a gift. Like, I'm not, you know, every moment's a gift. My family's a gift. I don't, you know, God doesn't owe me anything. You know, there's this misconception that we are God, kind of our own God, and, you know, we'll follow along with this God thing if I get what I want. And if nothing, you know, if nothing harms me, then we're good. You know, and that's not a true, you know, that's not the true gospel. And the gospel truth is that we are to die to ourselves and submit ourselves to Him. And if there's suffering in there, then we do that with joy, because we know who God is, and we know that we know what He did on the cross, and what's been given to us, and we submit our life to Him. That's just it. It's that simple.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Do you wanna just tell people where they can find you if they wanna listen to your podcast, listen to your show, and then if they can give you any support?
Sure. DonCorcoran.com, and there you will find the stories, and then the Time Machine podcast is the stories we talked about where I walk, and those are great because I love those because I get to just sit and listen. That's 90%, you know, people sharing their cancer journey, and there's such wisdom and value in hearing people that are, you know, faced and confronted with those things. You get to hear directly from them. So those are the areas. The Time Machine podcast, and you can find us at Point of Contact is my company. So DonCorcoran.com, Point of Contact, Time Machine, and that is how you find me.
Hey everyone, I'd like to thank you if you made it this far. Hope you really enjoyed that interview. Every time Don speaks, I seem to take something from it. He's pretty wise. So yeah, thank you. And I would like to say a little bit of what Don shared with me after we turned off the mic. He was talking about when Kobe died and just about the coronavirus and stuff like that. And he was saying that even he who grew up, you know, watching him, he never got to go see a game, even though he worked near the center and everything like that. But he was saying that the reason why, like, all these mothers who had never cared about basketball before and all these families were actually devastated when Kobe died was because people like that kind of serve as like a mirror for themselves. They see when these little kids die, or when big stars with like wealth and everything that they possibly could have in the world, when they die, it's kind of like a realization or a mirror, and you're able to see yourselves in that, and it's just like you see how vulnerable we are. And we got into a discussion about like how it's not really safe to put your faith into something that is finite, and that's the mistake that a lot of us make here. We put our faith into wealth. We put our faith into someone, a partner. We put our faith into the earth. But the truth is that we live in a finite universe. It's gonna end. And yeah, I think what you see through dawn is the realization and finding humility and joy in that. When you go in nature and realize how there's kind of like this peace in knowing how small you are, I guess. But yeah, not to be too dismal in all of this, I think that it is important to find joy in all of this. The truth is that we are finite beings. But yeah, just share love with your family and stuff like that, and your friends, and enjoy every moment. Thank you. I do have some more interviews planned within the next few weeks, but with the coronavirus and everything like that, with school shutting down, it's who knows what's gonna happen. I don't know where I'll be next week. So thank you.